Before I met the Penwrights, I never thought much about revenge. Growing up, I believed in moving on, in letting go and forgiving. My mother always said that holding grudges was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. But the Penwrights, they had a philosophy that was entirely different. Eleanor Greene is my name. Well, Eleanor Penwright now, and what I'm going to tell you is how I discovered the family I married into has been orchestrating calculated acts of revenge for more than a century. Not the dramatic, bloody kind you see in movies. No, the Penwrights specialized in something far more insidious. Something patient and meticulous, revenge that unfolded so gradually the victims never even knew they were targets. During my final year at university, I met James Penwright. I was studying architecture, spending most of my days in the design studio, when he walked in to give a guest lecture on historical preservation. He was tall with warm hazel eyes and an earnest smile that made his whole face light up. My attention was captured by James immediately. He spoke with such passion about his family's architectural firm, detailing their commitment to preserving historical buildings across New England. When the lecture was over, I worked up the courage to ask him about internship opportunities. His card was given to me by James, our fingers brushing as he handed it over. The Penwright Group is always looking for fresh talent, he said, especially those who understand that buildings hold memories. That phrase stayed with me. Buildings hold memories. I would later realize just how literal the Penwrights were about that concept. Sitting in the Penwright Group's main office came 2 weeks later, a beautifully restored Victorian in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood. The interior was a perfect blend of historical details and modern functionality. Walls covered in architectural drawings and family photographs spanning generations were framed by original crown moldings. Walter Penwright, James' grandfather, founded the firm in 1947 after returning from World War II. Before him was Edgar Penwright, who had been a master carpenter in the early 1900s. The Penwright lineage stretched back over a century, a line of builders, architects, and craftsmen. After graduation, my internship quickly turned into a full-time job offer, and my professional relationship with James evolved into something more personal. A walking tour of Boston's hidden architectural gems was our first date. James pointed out details most people would miss. A particular type of brick pattern, an unusual window frame, a doorway with symbols subtly worked into the design. My family believes buildings should tell stories, he told me, his hand warm in mine as we walked through the crisp autumn air. Not just about their owners, but about the craftsmen who built them, the history they've witnessed. First, I fell in love with James's mind, his encyclopedic knowledge of architectural history, his attention to detail, his reverence for craftsmanship. The rest of me followed quickly enough. 8 months later, on the rooftop garden of a building his firm had recently restored, he proposed. The ring he offered had belonged to his grandmother, a delicate arrangement of sapphires and diamonds that looked both antique and timeless. The Penwrights have always believed in preserving the past, he said as he slipped it onto my finger. And building a future. Without hesitation, I said yes. What I'd really agreed to wasn't something I began to understand until after the wedding. About an hour outside Boston, the Penwright family estate, Thornfield, sat on 5 acres of land. The main house was a sprawling Queen Anne-style mansion built in 1897 with multiple additions that somehow managed to maintain the architectural integrity of the original structure. James had mentioned we'd be living there after the honeymoon, but I'd assumed he meant in one of the guest cottages on the property, not in the main house with his entire family. It's tradition, he explained as we drove up the long tree-lined driveway. Penwrights stay together. Always have. I noticed his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. His usual easy manner was replaced by something tense and formal, but I was too distracted by the house to give it much thought. Magnificent was Thornfield. 3 stories of red brick and dark wood trim with a corner tower and wraparound porch. The walls were climbed by ivy, framing windows that gleamed in the late afternoon sun. At the front door, James' parents, Richard and Sylvia Penwright, greeted us. Richard was an older version of James. Same height, same hazel eyes, though his were cooler, more assessing. Sylvia was petite and elegant, her silver hair cut in a sleek bob that emphasized her sharp cheekbones. With polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, they welcomed me. "Eleanor," Richard said, taking my hand between both of his. His grip was firm, almost painful. "Welcome to the family. We've prepared the East Wing for you both," Sylvia added. "For newlyweds to have their own space within Thornfield, it's tradition." I learned that evening that the East Wing wasn't just a bedroom, but an entire section of the house, complete with a sitting room, office, and private bathroom. Divided into sections for each branch of the family was the Penwright home. The central portion was occupied by James' parents. In the West Wing lived his Uncle Edward and Aunt Marianne with their daughter Cecilia, who was about my age. In the South Wing lived his grandfather, Walter, now 94, with a full-time nurse. What about the North Wing? I asked during dinner, noticing that no one had mentioned it. A silence fell over the table. James cleared his throat. "It's mainly storage now. Family archives, old furniture, that sort of thing. We don't use it much," Richard added, his tone indicating the subject was closed. That night, as James and I settled into our new quarters, I couldn't help but feel like I'd stepped into a Gothic novel. The East Wing was beautifully appointed. Freshly painted walls, polished hardwood floors, furniture that looked both antique and comfortable. But there was something off about the space. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Do you feel it?" James asked as we lay in bed, the moonlight casting shadows across our room. "Feel what?" He was quiet for a moment. "The house. It has a presence." I laughed nervously. "You mean it's haunted?" "Not exactly." He turned to face me, his expression serious in the dim light. "Thornfield was built by my great-great-grandfather, Edwin Penwright. He believed buildings absorb the emotions of the people who live in them, that the very walls can hold memories. Like you said in your lecture, buildings hold memories." James nodded. "It's more than just a saying to us. It's a fundamental belief, and it's why we've always been so focused on preservation." He hesitated. "There's a lot about my family you don't know yet, Eleanor. But you will. We don't keep secrets from each other. That's another Penwright tradition." I should have pressed him for details then. But I was tired from the travel, and the weight of joining a new family with all its traditions and expectations was already heavy on my shoulders. So I simply kissed him and drifted off to sleep, telling myself I had plenty of time to learn the Penwright ways. In a blur of adjustment, the first month at Thornfield passed. I continued working at the Penwright Group's Boston office, commuting with James each day. At night, we returned to the estate for formal family dinners that felt more like business meetings. Ongoing projects were discussed by the Penwrights, architectural techniques were debated, and occasionally they reminisced about family history. They were unfailingly polite to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider, except with Walter, James's grandfather. The elderly man took a liking to me immediately, insisting I visit him in the South Wing whenever I had time. His rooms were filled with books, architectural models, and strange artifacts collected over a lifetime. "You have good eyes," he told me during one of our first conversations. "You see details others miss." "That's why I became an architect," I replied. Walter smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "No, child. You became an architect because you understand that buildings are more than just structures. They're vessels." "Vessels for what?" "Intent," he said simply. "Every building has a purpose beyond the obvious. The Penwrights have always understood that." It was during my third month at Thornfield that I first ventured into the North Wing. James was away on a business trip to Chicago, overseeing the restoration of a historic theater. I'd been working from home that day, finishing designs for a new project when a power outage hit the East Wing. Richard was in Boston and Sylvia was attending a charity luncheon. The housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, informed me that the circuit breaker for our section was located in the north wing. "I can reset it for you, Mrs. Penwright," she offered, her tone nervous. "No need," I said. "Just point me to the right panel and I'll handle it." Mrs. Winters hesitated, then gave me detailed directions, adding, "Please don't wander, ma'am. The north wing it's not maintained like the rest of the house." The entrance to the north wing was a heavy oak door at the end of the main corridor, locked with an old-fashioned key that hung on a hook nearby. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The air was different here, cooler, with a faint metallic scent that reminded me of old pennies. Unlike the rest of Thornfield, the north wing showed its age. Wallpaper peeled in corners, and dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light coming through partially covered windows. But even in its neglected state, I could see the craftsmanship in the woodwork, the careful attention to detail that marked all Penwright constructions. The electrical panel was found by me easily enough, and the tripped breaker was reset. But as I turned to leave, a half-open door caught my attention. Beyond it was what appeared to be a library, shelves of leather-bound books lining the walls. Curiosity pulled me forward. The room was large with a massive desk at its center and reading chairs positioned near a cold fireplace. Unlike the hallway, this room seemed well maintained. No dust, no signs of neglect. Someone came here regularly. What drew me to the desk, I can't say. Perhaps it was the architect in me admiring the quality of the woodwork, or perhaps something deeper. An instinct I didn't yet understand. The desk had multiple drawers, all locked except one. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn with age. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that even as my fingers traced the embossed initials on the cover. E.P. Edwin Penwright, the builder of Thornfield, James's great-great-grandfather. The journal's pages were yellowed but well preserved. The handwriting was neat, methodical, each entry dated and detailed. I flipped to a random page dated June 17, 1898. Construction completed on the Henderson residence today. As instructed by client, included the modifications to the western wall. Estimated timeline for structural compromise, 15 to 20 years. Payment received in full. Note, Henderson failed to credit my designs for the Burlington project last year. Patience will deliver what confrontation cannot. I frowned, rereading the entry. It sounded like Edwin had deliberately built a flaw into someone's home. A flaw designed to cause problems years later. But that couldn't be right. The Penwrights were known for their impeccable craftsmanship, their buildings standing the test of time. I flipped to another entry. This one from 1901. Completed interior work on Caldwell's office building. Installed the special ventilation system as designed. Effects should begin within 6 to 8 months. Subtle at first, increasing gradually. Caldwell will never connect his symptoms to the building. A fitting response to his theft of my land investment opportunity. My heart began to race. These entries weren't just odd. They were disturbing. They suggested deliberate sabotage, calculated to harm people who had wronged Edwin Penwright in some way. And not immediate harm, but slow, insidious damage that would take years to manifest. I was so absorbed in the journal that I didn't hear the footsteps until they were right outside the door. Quickly, I returned the book to its drawer and moved to one of the bookshelves, pretending to browse the titles. Walter Penwright wheeled himself into the room, his nurse following behind him. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "Ah, Eleanor, I see you found the family library." His voice was casual, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. "The power went out in the east wing," I explained. "I came to reset the breaker and got curious about this room." Walter nodded, dismissing his nurse with a wave. When we were alone, he wheeled closer to me. "What did you think of Edwin's journal?" I froze. There was no point denying it. Walter had clearly seen me replace the book. "I only read a couple of entries," I admitted. "They were confusing. Not confusing, Walter corrected. Just honest. Edwin believed in recording his work precisely. He moved to the desk, opened the drawer, and retrieved the journal. The Penwrights have always understood the power of architecture, Eleanor. Not just to shelter and impress, but to influence, to correct. Those entries made it sound like he was deliberately harming people. Walter's smile was thin. Harming is such a blunt word. Edwin preferred balancing the scales. People who wronged him experienced consequences, yes, but proportional ones. A man who stole credit for Edwin's work found his own home becoming gradually uninhabitable. A business rival who sabotaged a contract developed mysterious health issues while working in his new office. He tapped the journal. Edwin was an artist of justice. I felt cold despite the summer heat. And did this art continue after Edwin? The methods evolved. Each generation of Penwrights has its own approach. Walter's gaze was steady. Richard prefers electrical systems. Subtle manipulations that cause inconvenience rather than harm. Your James has a gift for acoustics. Did you know certain sound frequencies can induce anxiety, even paranoia, when experienced over time? The implications hit me like a physical blow. The Penwright Group's restoration projects, their custom homes, their historical preservation work. Were they all vehicles for this twisted form of revenge? Why are you telling me this? I managed to ask. Because you're a Penwright now, and Penwrights don't keep secrets from family, Walter wheeled back slightly. Besides, James said you had the right temperament, that you understood nuance. I thought of James, my husband, the man I loved. Had he been assessing me all along, looking for signs that I could accept this family legacy? I need to think, I said, moving toward the door. Walter nodded. Of course, take your time. But remember, Eleanor, you've already participated. That historical society renovation you've been working on for the past month, the one where you suggested those innovative ventilation adjustments. Mr. Barrett will find his precious archives developing mold issues in about 2 years. Gradual, untraceable mold that will destroy his collection piece by piece. Just as he destroyed James' reputation with the Historical Commission last year. I left the North Wing in a daze, Walter's words echoing in my mind. He was right. I had designed those ventilation adjustments, thinking I was creating an energy-efficient system. James had praised my innovation, suggested minor tweaks. Had I unwittingly become part of the Penwright revenge machine? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, re-examining every project I'd worked on since joining the firm. How many of my designs had been subtly modified for vengeful purposes? How many clients were unknowingly living or working in buildings designed to punish them? When James returned from Chicago the following evening, I was waiting in our sitting room, Walter's revelations heavy between us, though I hadn't yet spoken them aloud. You've been to the North Wing, he said immediately, setting down his suitcase. It wasn't a question. Your grandfather showed me Edwin's journal. I watched his face carefully. He told me about the family business. The real one. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. I wanted to tell you myself, after you'd had more time to adjust to the family. Adjust to what, exactly? My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. The fact that my husband's family has been engaging in elaborate architectural revenge for over a century. That my own designs might have been used to hurt people. Not hurt, James corrected quickly, echoing Walter. Balance. And not random people. Only those who truly deserve it. Who decides that? Who appointed the Penwrights judge, jury, and executioner? James sat down across from me, his expression earnest. We're not vigilantes, Eleanor. We're craftsmen. We build consequences into our work for those who abuse power, who harm others and escape conventional justice. He leaned forward. Think about Barrett at the Historical Society. He deliberately sabotaged my preservation proposal because I wouldn't hire his nephew's construction company, a company with multiple safety violations. His actions cost the community a chance to save a historic landmark. So, you're punishing him by destroying the archives he cares about, I said flatly. We're teaching him that actions have consequences. The mold won't spread to irreplaceable documents. We've designed it to target only the replaceable storage materials. He'll have a massive inconvenience and expense, just as he caused for us and the community. I shook my head, struggling to reconcile the man I loved with these revelations. Why not just report his nepotism to the board? We did. They did nothing. That's often how it goes. The conventional channels fail, and the powerful remain unaccountable. James moved to kneel before me, taking my hands in his. The Penwrights have always existed in that gap, Eleanor. Where official justice fails, we ensure balance is still maintained. I pulled my hands away. And you never thought to mention this before I married into the family? Before I became complicit? Would you have believed me? Or would you have thought I was disturbed? His eyes searched mine. I wanted you to see the family first, to understand our commitment to craft and legacy. The rest, it needed context. Context, I repeated. For systematic revenge plots carried out through building design. We never target the innocent, James insisted. And we never cause harm disproportionate to the offense. That's the Penwright Code. I stood up, needing distance. I need time to process this, James. I can't just accept that my life's work might be used as a weapon. He nodded, his expression pained but understanding. Take all the time you need. But please, don't make any decisions until you've heard the full history. There's more to this than Walter told you. That night, I slept in one of the guest rooms. The next morning, I called in sick to the office and spent the day walking the grounds of Thornfield, trying to sort through my thoughts. The estate was beautiful, the gardens meticulously maintained, ancient trees providing shade from the summer sun. It was hard to reconcile this peaceful place with the calculated vengeance that apparently financed it. By evening, I'd made a decision. I would hear James out, learn the full history he mentioned. Not because I was ready to accept this family legacy, but because I needed to understand the extent of what I'd married into before deciding whether to stay or go. I found James in his study, reviewing blueprints. He looked up when I entered, hope and weariness battling in his expression. I want to know everything, I said without preamble. The full history, as you put it. Relief washed over his features. Thank you. But not here. We need to go to the North Wing. To the archive room. The archive room turned out to be beyond the library I'd discovered, accessible through a hidden door behind one of the bookshelves. James activated some mechanism and the shelf swung outward, revealing a temperature-controlled room filled with filing cabinets, display cases, and a large central table. Richard and Walter were waiting for us, along with James's uncle Edward. Sylvia and Marianne were noticeably absent. The women in the family are given the choice, Richard explained when I asked. They can know everything and participate, know everything and abstain, or know only what's necessary for plausible deniability. Sylvia chose the third option. Marianne, too. And what about Cecilia? I asked, thinking of James's quiet cousin. She's fully involved, Edward said. Has been since college. She has quite a talent for landscape architecture. Did you know certain plants can affect soil pH over time? Very useful for properties with extensive gardens. I felt sick but forced myself to focus. You said there was more to the history than what Walter told me. James nodded, moving to one of the display cases. Inside was an old photograph in a silver frame. A family portrait from what looked like the 1890s. A stern-faced man I assumed was Edwin Penwright stood behind a seated woman with 3 children arranged around them. This is where it began, James said. With Edwin and his family, but not in the way you might think. Richard took over the narrative. In 1892, Edwin Penwright was a respected architect in Boston, known for his innovative designs and attention to detail. He had a thriving practice, a loving family, and a reputation for absolute integrity. He gestured to the photograph. That summer, Edwin was hired to design a new city hall for a growing industrial town north of Boston. The commission was substantial, and Edwin poured himself into the project. Walter wheeled closer, his voice soft but clear. The town's mayor and several council members had connections to a rival architectural firm. They used Edwin's designs, but claimed they were unsatisfactory. Walter's gnarled hands tightened on the arms of his wheelchair. My father was one of those children. He was 12 when his mother died, when he had to abandon his education to work 14-hour days in a textile mill. James placed a hand on his grandfather's shoulder before continuing. 2 years after Margaret's death, Edwin was hired as a carpenter on a new mansion being built for the former mayor, now Senator Williams. It was ironic. The man who had stolen Edwin's designs and destroyed his career now needed his skills, though he didn't recognize the broken architect in the weathered laborer. "Let me guess," I said. "Edwin sabotaged the construction." "Not immediately," Richard replied. "First, he observed. He noticed that Williams was having an affair with his secretary, that he was embezzling campaign funds, that he abused his staff. Edwin realized that men like Williams never faced consequences through conventional means. Their connections and money protected them." Walter took up the story again. "Edwin worked on that mansion for 8 months, and during that time, he designed subtle flaws into the structure. Nothing that would cause immediate harm, but imperfections that would manifest over years. Windows that would let in drafts no matter how well sealed. Floors that would creak and shift no matter how often repaired. Pipes that would develop slow leaks in hard-to-reach places. It wasn't about revenge." "Not really," James said, his voice gentle. "It was about justice, about ensuring that a man who thought himself above consequences would face them in ways he couldn't escape or buy his way out of." Edward, who had been silent until now, added, "Edwin discovered something important during that project, that architecture could be a vehicle for delayed consequences, that buildings could deliver justice when courts and society failed to." Richard moved to another display case, this one containing what looked like architectural drawings. After the Williams mansion, Edwin slowly rebuilt his life. He worked under assumed names at first, his true identity hidden, but he continued his practice of building consequences into his designs, only for those who had committed serious wrongs and escaped conventional justice. He kept meticulous records, Walter said, gesturing to several leather-bound journals similar to the one I'd found. Every case documented, every offense noted, every consequence designed to fit the crime. He was not capricious or cruel. He was methodical, judicial. James guided me to the central table where a family tree was displayed under glass. As Edwin's sons grew older, he taught them his methods, not just architectural techniques, but his philosophy of balanced consequences. And when they showed the right temperament and judgment, he taught them his secret craft as well. And so it continued, Richard said. Generation after generation. The Penwright name was slowly restored in the architectural community, though the family never again reached the prominence Edwin once enjoyed, but that was by design. We learned to operate more quietly, to build our reputation for quality and preservation while maintaining our true purpose. Which is what, exactly? I asked. Vigilante justice through building design. We prefer to think of it as specialized consequences for specialized situations, Edward replied. The Penwrights don't target everyone who does wrong, only those who abuse power and privilege to harm others and escape conventional accountability. Walter wheeled over to another display case, this one containing newspaper clippings. In 1943, a factory owner named Harrison deliberately ignored safety regulations, resulting in a fire that killed 17 workers. He bribed officials to clear him of wrongdoing. He tapped the glass above a yellowed clipping. 2 years later, my father designed Harrison's new office building. The ventilation system subtly distributed cotton dust. Not enough to cause immediate problems, but enough that Harrison developed the same chronic lung disease his workers suffered from. He lived with that consequence for 30 years. In the 1970s, Richard added, a developer bulldozed a historic black neighborhood to build luxury condominiums, leaving 60 families homeless. The courts ruled in his favor due to legal technicalities. When he hired the Penwright Group to design his vacation home in 1978, I ensured that subtle structural issues would render it uninhabitable within a decade, just as he had done to those families. James squeezed my hand. Each generation of Penwrights has brought new techniques, new understanding to the work. What Edwin began with crude structural modifications, we've refined into something more precise. Today we can design consequences that affect only the specific individual who deserves them, without collateral damage. I pulled my hand away, my mind reeling. And you all believe this is justified? That you have the right to appoint yourselves judges? We don't seek out people to punish, James said earnestly. We simply ensure that those who come to us with blood on their hands don't escape the consequences of their actions. And who are you, exactly, to make these judgments? I challenged. What makes the Penwrights qualified to decide who deserves punishment and what form it should take? Walter's aged face creased in a smile that held no humor. We're not special, Eleanor. We're just one family that refused to accept that might makes right, that the powerful can harm the vulnerable without consequence. We use the skills we have to restore balance where we can. And we're careful, Edward added. Every case is researched thoroughly. Multiple family members must agree before any action is taken. We require documentation, evidence. We're more rigorous than most courts. I walked around the table, trying to process everything I was hearing. The Penwrights clearly believed in their cause, saw themselves as agents of justice rather than revenge. And I couldn't deny the examples they cited involved genuine wrongdoing that had gone unpunished. But still. What about the law? I asked. What you're doing, it's illegal. It's property damage at minimum. So is much of what our targets do, Richard replied calmly. The difference is they break laws and harm people for profit or power. We design consequences only to balance scales that should have been balanced by legitimate means. James approached me cautiously. I know this is overwhelming, and I know I should have found a way to explain it before we married, but I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid you wouldn't understand. Understand what? I said. That my husband is part of a multi-generational conspiracy to exact revenge through building design. The absurdity of it struck me suddenly, and I laughed despite myself. It sounds insane when I say it aloud. Not revenge, James corrected gently. Justice. There's a difference. I looked around the archive room at the carefully preserved records of a century of Penwright justice. At the solemn faces of the men watching me, men who truly believed in what they were doing. I need time, I said finally. Real time and space. It's too much to process all at once. Of course, Richard nodded. Take whatever time you need. But I hope you'll consider what we've shared carefully. The Penwright legacy isn't just about consequences. It's about standing against the abuse of power when all other remedies have failed. James walked me back to the East Wing in silence. At the door to our quarters, he finally spoke. I love you, Eleanor. That has never been part of any plan or calculation. Whatever you decide about the family legacy, my feelings for you are separate and real. I believed him. Despite everything, I believed that James loved me. But I wasn't sure that was enough anymore. The following week was the longest of my life. I took a leave of absence from work, claiming a family emergency, which wasn't entirely untrue. James moved into one of the guest rooms, giving me space while remaining available if I wanted to talk. The rest of the family maintained a polite distance, though I occasionally caught Walter watching me with those keen eyes that seemed to see too much. I spent hours in Thornfield's gardens, walking the grounds, and trying to sort through my conflicted feelings. The Penwrights weren't monsters. At least they didn't see themselves that way. They had a strict code, targeted only those they believed truly deserved consequences, and designed those consequences to fit the original offense. In many ways, they were more measured than the justice system itself. But they were still appointing themselves judges and executioners, still making unilateral decisions about who deserved punishment and what form it should take. No matter how they justified it, that fundamental arrogance troubled me deeply. On the 7th day of my self-imposed isolation, I found myself drawn back to the North Wing. No one tried to stop me as I used the key from its hook and entered the now familiar corridor. This time, I bypassed the library and went straight to the hidden archive room, which James had shown me how to access. Inside, I began methodically examining the records, starting with Edwin's original journals and working forward through the decades. I wanted to understand the full scope of the Penwright legacy, to see for myself whether their claims of careful targeting and proportional consequences held true. What I found was both better and worse than I'd feared. The Penwrights were indeed selective. Their justice was reserved for those who had committed serious wrongs and escaped conventional accountability. The consequences they designed were calculated to reflect the original harm. A slum lord who let tenants freeze would find his own home impossible to heat properly. A CEO whose factory polluted a river would discover his vacation home developing mysterious water issues. But there were also cases that made me deeply uncomfortable. Instances where the family's judgment seemed more personal than principled. A critic who had savaged Richard's early work found his newly renovated office developing acoustic problems that made concentration difficult. A rival firm that had poached Penwright clients experienced mysterious issues with multiple projects shortly afterward. As I reached the more recent records, those involving James and his generation, I noticed a shift in methodology. The consequences had become more sophisticated, more targeted, less about physical discomfort or property damage, more about creating specific psychological effects, anxiety triggered by certain sound frequencies, subtle lighting that disrupted sleep patterns, airflow designed to induce mild respiratory reactions. In one of the last files, I found something that made my blood run cold: detailed plans for the historical society renovation I'd been working on. My original designs had been subtly modified, not just to create the mold issue Walter had mentioned, but to incorporate sound patterns that would induce anxiety in Barrett, specifically calibrated to his typical working hours and the location of his office. I was still staring at these plans when the door opened and James entered. He didn't seem surprised to find me there. "I thought you might come back to do your own research," he said, closing the door behind him. "It's what I would have done." I held up the modified plans. "You changed my designs without telling me." He had the grace to look ashamed. "Yes. I shouldn't have done that. Were you ever going to tell me? Or just let me be an unwitting accomplice?" "I was working up to it," James admitted. "Testing the waters with theoretical discussions about justice and consequences. I knew I needed to tell you before the project was completed, but I was a coward. I was afraid of losing you. So instead, you made me complicit without my knowledge or consent. I set the plans down carefully, controlling my anger. That's not how someone treats a partner, James. That's how someone treats a tool." He flinched. "You're right. I was wrong. All I can say is that the Penwright legacy, it becomes part of you. The secrecy, the careful calculations, they become second nature." He moved closer, though still keeping his distance. "But I never saw you as a tool, Eleanor. Never. I saw you as someone who might understand, who might eventually share in this work willingly. And if I don't? If I decide I can't be part of this?" James was quiet for a long moment. Then we'll respect your decision. You won't be asked to participate, and will ensure your work is never used without your knowledge again. The Penwrights have had family members who chose not to participate before, like Marianne. We don't force anyone. And what about our marriage? That's entirely separate, he said quickly. At least it is for me. I love you, Eleanor. Whether you embrace the family legacy or not, that hasn't changed. I studied his face, looking for signs of deception. But all I saw was fear and hope battling in his eyes. He truly did love me. And despite everything, I still loved him. But love wasn't the only factor in this equation. I need to ask you something, I said. And I need the absolute truth. Anything. Has anyone ever been seriously injured or killed as a result of Penwright justice? James shook his head firmly. No. Never. That's a line we've never crossed. The consequences we design are meant to create discomfort, inconvenience, even financial hardship in some cases, but never physical harm beyond minor symptoms like those the targets themselves caused others. And have you ever targeted someone who didn't deserve it? Someone innocent? Or someone whose offense was minor? He hesitated. The definition of deserving has varied somewhat across generations. Edwin and his sons were harsher in their judgments than we are today. And yes, there have been cases, like the critic who attacked Richard's work, that seem more about wounded pride than true justice. James ran a hand through his hair. We're not perfect, Eleanor. We're human, with human flaws. But we try to hold ourselves to the principles Edwin established: target only those who have caused serious harm and escaped conventional justice, design consequences proportional to the original offense, avoid collateral damage to innocence. I nodded, absorbing his words. One last question. If I asked you to stop, to walk away from this legacy completely, would you? The question clearly caught him off guard. James opened his mouth, then closed it again, genuinely considering his answer. I don't know, he finally said. I'd like to say yes without hesitation. But this work, it's been part of my identity since I was old enough to understand it. I believe in what we do, in the balance we maintain. He met my gaze directly. I think I could step back, design buildings without hidden consequences. But could I stand by knowing that people like Barrett continue to harm others without facing any repercussions? I'm not sure. His honesty, painful as it was, meant something. He wasn't trying to tell me what I wanted to hear. Thank you for being truthful, I said. I need more time to think. Of course. James moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I think you would be good at this. Not because you're cruel or vengeful, but because you're thoughtful. You'd bring balance to our judgments. Question our motives. Ensure we don't stray from our principles. He gave me a sad smile. But I'll respect whatever you decide. After he left, I remained in the archive room for hours, reviewing more cases, examining the evolution of the Penwright methods over generations. By the time I emerged, night had fallen, and Thornfield was quiet. I found Walter in the south wing, sitting by a window overlooking the gardens, a book open in his lap. He looked up as I entered, those shrewd eyes taking my measure. Have you reached a decision? He asked. Not yet. But I have questions only you can answer. Walter gestured to the chair across from him. Ask. I sat down, choosing my words carefully. James told me no one has ever been seriously harmed by Penwright justice. Is that true? Physically harmed? Yes, that's true. We've never designed consequences meant to cause bodily injury or death. Walter's voice was steady. Financially ruined? Psychologically distressed? Yes, those have happened. But only to those who inflicted similar or worse fates on others. And the family truly believes this is justified? That you have the right to decide these matters? Walter's gaze was unflinching. We don't claim any special right, Eleanor. We simply refuse to accept that might makes right, that those with power can harm others without consequence. He leaned forward slightly. Consider this. When conventional justice fails, when courts are corrupted, when money buys immunity, when victims have no recourse, what options remain? Accept that the powerful are above accountability, or find alternative means to restore balance. I considered his words. But who watches the watchers? Who ensures the Penwrights don't abuse this power? We watch each other, Walter replied. Every consequence must be approved by multiple family members. Evidence must be presented. Proportionality debated. We've rejected more cases than we've accepted over the years. He smiled faintly. And now, perhaps, you will watch us as well. Your perspective would be valuable. You question in ways the rest of us sometimes forget to. His assumption that I might join them irritated me. I haven't made that decision. No, but you're considering it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here asking these questions. Walter closed his book. You know, Edwin believed that true justice required both passion and restraint, the drive to right wrongs, but the discipline to do so proportionally. The Penwrights have sometimes tilted too far in one direction or the other. New perspectives help restore that balance. I stood up, needing to end the conversation before his words could sway me further. Good night, Walter. Good night, Eleanor. Whatever you decide, remember this, the Penwright legacy isn't just about consequences. It's about standing for those who cannot stand for themselves when all other options have failed them. His words followed me back to the East Wing, where I spent another restless night weighing impossible choices. In the morning, I called James and asked him to meet me in the gardens. He found me sitting on a stone bench beside a reflecting pool, the summer flowers in full bloom around us. I've made my decision, I said as he sat beside me. James nodded, his expression carefully neutral, though I could see the tension in his shoulders. I can't fully embrace the Penwright legacy, I began. The idea of appointing ourselves judges, it still troubles me deeply. But I also can't ignore the reality that conventional justice often fails, that the powerful do escape accountability for serious harms. I turned to face him directly. So, here's my proposal. I'll remain with you, with the family. I won't leave or expose your activities. But I want oversight. Real oversight of the Penwright justice system. James frowned. What do you mean? I want veto power over cases. If I believe someone doesn't deserve your brand of consequences, or if the proposed response seems disproportionate, you all agree to abandon that case. No exceptions. You want to be the family's conscience, James said slowly. Someone needs to be. From what I've seen in the archives, the Penwrights have sometimes strayed from their principles, targeted people for personal slights, designed consequences driven more by anger than justice. I held his gaze. If I'm going to be part of this family, I need to know there are checks and balances. Real ones. James was quiet for a long moment, considering. The others won't like it. Particularly the older generation. Then I walk away. From the family, from Thornfield, from you. The words hurt to say, but I meant them. This is my condition, James. Take it or leave it. I'll need to discuss it with them, he said finally. But I'll advocate for your position. I think you're right. We do need someone to question our judgments, to ensure we don't become what we claim to stand against. 2 days later, the entire Penwright family gathered in the dining room for what felt like a formal hearing. Richard, Sylvia, Edward, Marianne, Walter, Cecilia, and James, all watching me as I presented my case. I laid out my concerns about their self-appointed authority, the potential for bias in their judgments, the lack of true accountability in their system. I'm not asking you to abandon your legacy, I concluded. I'm asking you to strengthen it by adding a layer of oversight, a check against vengeance masquerading as justice. Walter spoke first. And if we refuse your terms? Then I leave today. And while I wouldn't expose your activities, I'm not interested in destroying this family, I would ensure my own work is never used for your purposes. Richard leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. And if we agree, what assurance do we have that you won't simply veto every case out of principle? None. You must accept my word that I'll judge each case on its merits. I'm not opposed to consequences for those who truly deserve them. I'm opposed to unilateral decisions about who deserves what. I met his gaze steadily. Just as you must trust my judgment, I must trust yours. That's the nature of checks and balances. The debate lasted hours. Edward and Richard were the most resistant, arguing that introducing a potential veto would undermine a system that had functioned effectively for generations. Walter, surprisingly, became my strongest advocate. Edwin would have approved, he said at one point. He always feared that future generations might lose sight of the true purpose behind his work. Justice, not revenge. Eleanor offers us a safeguard against that drift. In the end, they agreed to my terms, with one condition of their own, would have veto power, but I would also be required to fully understand each case before rendering judgment. No summary dismissals without reviewing all evidence and hearing all arguments. That's reasonable, I conceded. I don't want to reject cases out of hand. I want to ensure they truly meet the standards you claim to uphold. And so I became not just a Penwright by marriage, but a new kind of Penwright, one who stood slightly apart from the family legacy while simultaneously becoming central to it. The conscience of a century-old system of architectural justice. Over the next year, I vetoed 7 cases out of 23 brought before the family. Some because the evidence of wrongdoing wasn't conclusive enough, others because the proposed consequences seemed disproportionate to the offense. In each instance, my judgment was respected, though not without debate. I also approved 16 cases, situations where the evidence of serious harm was clear, where conventional justice had demonstrably failed, and where the designed consequences seemed truly proportional. I even contributed to some of those designs, finding ways to make them more precisely targeted, less likely to affect innocent bystanders. My first approved case involved a nursing homeowner who had systematically neglected residents while falsifying records to maintain his license and government funding. Multiple complaints had been filed, inspections conducted, yet he remained in business, his political connections shielding him from meaningful consequences. When he hired the Penwright Group to design his new vacation home, I approved subtle modifications to the heating and cooling systems. Nothing that would cause physical harm, but adjustments that would make the property perpetually uncomfortable, requiring constant maintenance and expense. A fitting echo of the discomfort he had inflicted on vulnerable residents in his care. James and I rebuilt our relationship slowly. The deception that had nearly torn us apart became, paradoxically, the foundation for a more honest partnership. We argued frequently about cases, challenging each other's assumptions and judgments. But those arguments strengthened rather than weakened our bond, forcing us to articulate our values and find common ground. 6 months after my confrontation with the family, I discovered I was pregnant. The news brought both joy and renewed questions about the legacy our child would inherit. Would we raise them to continue the Penwright tradition, or shield them from knowledge of it until they were old enough to make their own choice? James and I discussed this at length, eventually agreeing that our child would be given the same option Sylvia had taken, to know only what was necessary until they were old enough to decide for themselves whether to embrace the full legacy. Walter died peacefully in his sleep 3 months before our daughter was born. He left me his journals, decades of reflections on the nature of justice, the proper use of the Penwright methods, the moral questions he had wrestled with throughout his life. His final entry, dated just a week before his death, mentioned me. Eleanor brings balance to the family. Her questions force us to examine our motives, to remember why Edwin began this work, not for vengeance but for justice, not to punish but to restore balance. The Penwright legacy is stronger for her skepticism, her insistence on proof and proportion. I go to my rest confident that what Edwin built will continue as he intended, neither devolving into mere revenge nor growing too timid to act when action is needed. We named our daughter Margaret, after Edwin's wife, the woman whose death had catalyzed the Penwright legacy. As I hold her, watching her sleep in the nursery we prepared in the East Wing, I often wonder what she will choose when the time comes. Will she embrace the family legacy as James has, reject it entirely, or find her own middle path as I have? Whatever she decides, I'm determined that it will be a true choice, one made with full knowledge and free will, not obligation or deception. And until that day comes, I'll continue my role as the conscience of the Penwrights, ensuring that what began as one man's quest for justice doesn't become merely an excuse for revenge. Because that's the thing about revenge. It's easy to justify, easy to disguise as justice. The line between the two is thin, constantly shifting. The Penwrights have walked that line for over a century, sometimes straying to one side or the other. My job is to help them stay on the right side, to ensure that their quiet, patient consequences remain proportional, targeted, and truly deserved. Some might say I've compromised my principles by joining this family enterprise. Perhaps I have. But I prefer to think I've found a way to temper it, to guide it closer to the justice it claims to serve. In a world where the powerful too often escape accountability, perhaps there is a place for the Penwrights after all, so long as someone stands ready to question their judgments, to demand evidence and proportion, to say enough when necessary. I never thought much about revenge before I met the Penwrights. Now I think about the difference between revenge and justice every day, and I hope that difference matters. Not just to me, but to everyone touched by the century of quiet consequences the Penwright family has built into the world around them.